Hello, YouTube. Welcome to Feisty Chess. I've got a feisty chess game for you today. This came from an online game I played a few years ago. I was white, my opponent was black on chess.com, and I played e4, as I typically do. My opponent played c6, and I breathed a small sigh of disappointment. The Caro-Kann defense is known to be strong and sturdy and somewhat boring. But nonetheless, I have a system against it that I've found great success with at my level because it's tricky and it's off the beaten path of the main line. And if the opponent tries to play mainline Caro-Kann type of moves, they often find themselves in a lot of trouble. So I played knight to c3, and then after d5, the main move to go into the main lines here would be d4. Instead, I played the two knights variation, which actually was the main line several decades ago. There's a lot of tricks and traps here. Black actually played pretty well. He played d takes e4. Of course, I recaptured with knight takes e4. One of the ways for black to go wrong here is to play bishop f5, which isn't outright terrible, but it gets black in some real sticky situations. And that's great because that's what black expects to be able to play in the Caro-Kann. But this guy knew that the two knights, the best idea is to just try to trade off this bishop for white's knight. With bishop g4, I gave the bishop a prod with h3, and he did trade it off, and I recaptured with my queen. So I'm happy in the opening here. White has a lead in development, and he has the two bishops. Black continued with e6. The plan of the Caro-Kann is to trade off that light squared bishop, and then put the pawns on light squares to control those squares. So I played my light square bishop to c4, hitting at that pawn chain, not very effectively for the moment, but the most active square for the bishop. Black then played his bishop to e7, probably the best place for it. I played d3, unleashing my dark square bishop and protecting both of my minor pieces in the middle of the board. Black, I think, lost a little bit of time by playing h6. I think knight to f6 maybe was a better try here, or maybe prepping that with knight to d7. He's afraid of a piece landing on g5, but I don't see any reason to really fear that immediately in this position. So this gives me time to get my bishop developed. I just go to d2 with it, intending maybe I keep it on this diagonal, looking at that h6, which may be a weakness. I can sacrifice a bishop to open up the black king side, or it can also come to c3 later. So the bishop is flexible here, and it's out of the way, and I'm ready to castle on either side of the board. Black now does play knight to f6, and I go ahead and castle queenside. Probably the more aggressive option, the feistier option, the more ornery option here. Against the Caro-Kann, I try to typically do this anyway, but especially against an opening like the Caro-Kann, I try to make the game very tactical, very interesting, very sharp, very active and aggressive. Caro-Kann players, I think, often want the other kind of game, the more slow, quiet, positional maneuvering game. So I want a game where we castle on opposite sides, and I give him an opportunity to castle kingside into that here. Well, first, I think to his credit, he plays a5. He's coming right at me on the king side. I've given him my king's address, and he's coming for him. So the race already begins. It may look like he has a threat here, but the threat really isn't there thanks to some tactics. So I was able to ignore this threat and play rook, my last rook into the game, rook h to e1. And now I've got both rooks firing down those center files. This e file is open, and I've got it lined up against the opponent's king. You might look at this and think, well, b5 is a good move for black. Let's look at this. b5, bishop b3, and then a4, and my bishop is trapped. I might find a way to sacrifice it to break up white's pawns in the middle, but maybe that's not so good for white. However, if black were to play b5 here, there's a tactic. You can pause your video to see it if you want. But if you just want to see it immediately, here goes. I can take on f6 with check. Once black recaptures with, say, the bishop, then I can just safely capture this pawn. I could actually do that in the other order as well, because once I take that pawn, this pawn can't take, it's pinned because my queen will take his rook on a8. So that's not really a threat in the position yet. Black goes ahead and castles kingside. I think it's a good move, but it's also the move I was wanting to see. Now, I do get a little bit leery of my bishop getting trapped there, now that his king is a little safer. So, it's still not a threat, but just to go ahead and get rid of that possibility, I play d4. Now you might think, I'm not sure this is the best move in the position. You might think it just gives away a pawn, but after queen takes d4, my bishop comes to d3. That's the whole idea of the move, is to give d3, give my bishop the d3 square. And if my king, if my bishop comes there, then next move coming is bishop to c3, and that queen is going to be under fire and have to retreat. And I've got both of those bishops and my knight and my queen all eyeing that king side, and I've got a lot of freedom of movement, and I like the looks of that position. Plus, my opponent's a Caro-Kann player, and I think they're not going to want to take any material if they think it might subject them to an attack. So even if that pawn is okay to take, even if it's not that poisoned, my opponent doesn't do that. He goes for knight to d7, trying to develop his pieces. So I'm sorry. Back up a second. First, he does play b5. So he's gaining time on my bishop and getting closer, inching closer to my king with his pawns. So, but I wanted to play my bishop here anyway, so that's fine. Now black plays knight to d7. And now in a situation where kings are castled on opposite sides, you push a pawn storm at your opponent's king, because there's nothing that these pawns are good for other than trying to crack that open. So the race is on. I play g4, he plays a4, and we're coming at each other's kings. Exciting game. So probably the best move here is just to go charge forward with g5. That guarantees that either the h-file or the g-file is going to open. This formation with a knight here on f6 and a pawn on h6 presents a nice hook for a white pawn to come in and open things up, crack the position open, because he can't afford to push forward with his pawn and to keep things closed. So that may have been a good move. Instead, I chose h4, trying to prepare that and being able to capture. If he captures on g5, I'll be able to capture with a pawn and keep the initiative, keep his knight running. He pushes ahead with his plan, of course, b4. And now I do push here, g5. Instead of taking with the pawn, he runs to d5 with his knight, a very good square for his knight, it must be said. And then I go ahead and try to open up the king side. I take on h6. So black, instead of recapturing on h6 and opening the file his king sits on, I think wisely plays g6, keeping things closed. I have an extra pawn for the time being, but that's not a very valuable extra pawn if his king's going to be there to corral it. I move another piece closer in the attack, knight to g5. And now my opponent, I think, makes a pretty big mistake. He plays his knight to f6, and not this knight, which isn't doing much on d7 to f6. He plays this d5 knight back to f6. Very passive move. I think he's overly concerned about maybe a check on h7 and his king getting a little bit boxed in tighter, but I don't really think there's any danger there. Really, what I'm concerned with is not pushing my pawn that's already on an open file, but rather sacrifices. So I'd urge you to pause the video here and try to find a good sacrificial idea, or maybe there's more than one. So if you pause the video, here's the sacrifice that I found. Bishop takes g6. And it's not really a sacrifice. That's a bit of a misleading term. You might call it a pseudo-sacrifice, in the sense that I'm actually recouping the material, at least as much material. So he takes the bishop on g6, and the obvious follow-up move then is knight takes e6. So not only do I have two pawns for that bishop, and a third pawn, if we want to count that one that I won earlier, but I'm forking the queen and the rook. So naturally the queen moves out of the way, and I might have better moves than taking that rook right here. Specifically, I can target that g6 pawn with queen g3 or queen d3, and that puts black in a whole heap of trouble. I went straight for the material, however, and grabbed on f8 with my knight. A good move, and I'm liking my position here. Now black makes another mistake, but it's a mistake that I can that I think one should be proud of. It's a very aggressive, interesting idea. He plays b3, and the threat here, maybe it's not immediately obvious, but once he takes on a2, there's really not any stopping that pawn from promoting. And not only that, once he does that, that'll be a promotion with checkmate. So that's a pretty big threat. Okay, so I can either deal with this or I can find another way of just executing my plan and not worrying about his threats. You can only do that for so long. And to do that in this position is pretty ornery. And that's why I'm happy I went for it. So the move I found was knight takes d7. This knight is becoming a desperado piece in a big way. So knight takes d7. It looks like it threatens the queen on b6, but of course black's next move is just simply to take on a2. And now if I take that queen, he's going to promote with a mate on a1. So I can't afford to do that. I need to make an escape square for my king. My opponent is getting a second queen. Surely I must be losing at this point, right? I find a quick move I can make first that wins me a little bit more material with my desperado knight. Knight takes f6 check. And after bishop takes f6, now I've got to do something about that. Checkmate. And I bring this bishop to c3, which nicely guards this b2 square as well. So I didn't think about this. I don't have the necessary material on the board for a second queen, so I'm going to use the old upside down rook. But black promotes here. We'll use the rook like that. That looked like a queen to you. Hopefully it doesn't look too much like a rook, but that is a second queen that black has. Obviously I have only one move, king to d2. Now interestingly, I've only got a rook for the queen in terms of material here, and some pawns, which is important. But black's two choices here are to take the rook on d1 with check, or to come to a2, the only safe square. And he has to save that queen, otherwise what was the point of really promoting it? So he decides to keep his queen, naturally, goes to a2 with it. You know what, we're going to swap these queens out for reasons that will become clear later. Here's his brand new queen. A nice brand spanking new queen here. This is also a queen. It's just less important to the game. Okay, the obvious move here for white is pretty obvious. It's queen takes f6, not only winning a bishop, now we've got a rook and a bishop for that queen that black has promoted, but also threatening a checkmate right there on g7. So black swings his new queen back into the game and seems to guard everything. And I could trade off queens here. That's doable. I could play queen takes f7, king takes f7, but he's got a queen and a rook, and I've got a rook and bishop, two rooks and a bishop. I might have a better game here. I probably do, but I'm really not interested in playing a technical kind of material imbalanced middle game where there's lots of chances for me to screw up against long distance queen forks that are difficult to see. So practically speaking, I find I think a much better move, and this is definitely the best move in the position. So I'd urge you to pause the video and see if you can find the best move here. Okay, so if you pause the video and if you found h7 check, congratulations. That's the move I was able to find, and I'm quite proud of it. It's a forcing move, it's a check. It makes use of that extra pawn, which I said might or might not be important earlier. The king can't run here because there's a mate if I promote on h8. The king also can't take the pawn because then his brand new queen is hanging. So his response is forced. Queen has to take. And what this does is get his queen out of the way of mine and allow me extra time without worrying about a queen trade to conduct my attack. So I bring another piece into the attack, rook to e7. And now I've got two big, nasty, heavy pieces right in the neighborhood of black's king. Fortunately for him, he has this check, which also gets his queen out of danger. I have to be careful here. Remember, this is a queen. So I have to be careful not to avoid any further to try to avoid any further checks. I play my king back to his home square here on e1, where he seems to be quite safe. And now I've got some big threats. My main threats are queen to f7 check, and look at this bishop on that long diagonal. Queen to f7 check, king to h8, and then d5 will open up that bishop with devastating effect. So he stops that threat and attacks my queen and gets his last piece into the game. His rook goes to f8. Attacks my queen. I hope you can see these pieces well enough. He attacks my queen, but in addition to queen f7, I have another similar idea. Sliding the queen over to e6 also gives check, also means his king has one place to go, h8. And you know the follow-up from here. d5 is a devastating check. He has to interpose a piece to block that bishop check. Really, as good as anything else here is imposing his new queen, which has lived a short but tragic life. There's one final trap here. In many cases where you have a choice of taking between rook and bishop, it's usually a good idea to take with the rook and keep that discovered check in reserve. That stores up a lot of energy in your position. But if I were to do that here, you might see that may be more devastating for black than for white. Certainly would be, because this queen, remember her, the original queen, she would come here if I were to move my rook away and give checkmate before I could think of using any discovered tactics. So fortunately I did see that, and I took with the bishop, which is more forcing, giving check. And from here on out, it's a little bit ugly, so you don't have to watch the whole thing. His only move is king here, and then I take on f8, which is also a check. Again, he's got one move, king to h8, and then I just find the quickest checkmate I can find, which queen to g7 is mate. So I won't argue that that's a pretty checkmate. There's a lot of pieces around the black king, and actually black just has one piece left here. But it was an exciting game, and honestly I like to show it because it's the only time I've ever played a game, and maybe the only game I've seen where where one person lets the opponent queen with check even and still has a winning attack. So I'm proud of that, and I was excited to be able to see that scenario and know that I had the resources to finish the attack, or at least intuitively know that. So kind of an ornery game, right? Let my opponent get what he wants on A1 with a promotion, but then nonetheless still have the upper hand, still keep the initiative, which in this game was worth more than that brand new queen. So another lesson from this game I like is playing against particular styles of play. A lot of times when people play a particular opening, it kind of gives away what they're after. And in the case of the Caro-Kann, they're typically after, not to paint with too broad a brush of all the Caro-Kann players, they're typically after a positional struggle where they have a solid position and is going to be a lot of maneuvering and a lot of subtlety, rather than pieces flying all over an open board, sacrifices, attacks, and things like that. So that's the kind of game I want to play against Caro-Kann. Even if I'm not that kind of a player naturally, I think it's good to play against your opponent. I'm not one of those guys that says play the board, not the opponent. Maybe the grandmasters can play that way, but I think even grandmasters will admit once in a while that there's a lot of psychology to chess, and there's a lot of value in not playing the absolute best move that a computer would pick, but playing the moves that you think your opponent is the most afraid of and that would make your opponent the most uncomfortable. As Emanuel Lasker said, chess is not a science. Maybe it's sort of a science, sort of an art, but first and foremost, chess is a fight, and giving yourself those psychological weapons is going to help you in your results for the vast majority of chess players out there. So I hope you've gotten something out of this video. I hope that was an entertaining game. I hope to present more of these kinds of games and these kinds of puzzles and interesting, active, tactical, feisty chess on this channel. Thanks so much.